everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today we are doing a recommendation video that I have been meaning to do truly for years, which is some of my favorite Celtic historical fantasy or historical fiction books, because some of these kind of ride the line between are they historical fantasy or are they historical fiction, but this is really probably my favorite subgenre niche. Many of my favorite books fall into Celtic historical fiction, historical fantasy. So if you watch my channel, you will probably recognize quite a few of these because it's a lot of my favorites. But let's just get into it. I'm going to sort of loosely categorize these as the ones that are more clearly historical fantasy, and then the ones that are a little more like historical fiction with like maybe a touch of the fantastical. But starting off with the historical fantasy leaning books, I think it'll be no surprise that we're going to start with one of my all-time favorites, Juliet Marillier. Juliet Marillier writes historical fantasy. Many of her books, honestly most of her books, are probably Celtic-inspired settings. If you want details about her books, her series, where to start, my thoughts on them, I have a whole playlist about Juliet Marillier with reviews, vlogs, a tier ranking video, an author guide, all of that, which I will link in the description. But to highlight some of her series that are specifically in Celtic settings, we of course have the Seven Waters series, which starts with Daughter of the Forest. This is a retelling of the Irish myth, the Six Swans, in which our main character must save her six brothers from the curse of an evil sorceress by undergoing a trial of endurance, pain, and love. Do check content warnings for this series though. There are some fairly graphic on-page events, but set in the same world, although following different characters. There's also the Blackthorn and Grimm series, which follows Blackthorn, who is a very prickly healer who has been imprisoned. She is given the opportunity to make a deal with the Fae to save her life, which she kind of has no other choice but to take. But it leads her to a situation where she must help the people around her and solve some mysteries based on local folklore. Along the way, she has her unlikely companion, Grimm. Also set in that world is the Warrior Bards trilogy, which follows some children of characters that we meet in the Blackthorn and Grimm series as they are training to become elite warriors, and they also have to kind of solve their own mysteries along the way. There's also the Breedy Chronicles, which starts with the Dark Mirror, which is following Breedy, who was a Pictish king, but this book follows him from childhood through his almost Arthurian rise to power to becoming this great king among the Picts. And then finally, I will just mention the Shadowfell trilogy, which is a YA series, which is set in a fantasy world that is heavily inspired by Scottish folklore. And in this, our main character has the magical ability to speak to the fair folk or the small folk. However, people in this world with magic are persecuted. So she is searching for the legendary Shadowfell, which may house a rebellion that she can join and keep her safe. Juliet Marillier, as I said, is one of my all-time favorite authors. Her writing is just beautiful and atmospheric. Her characters, I think, just have such great internal strength, and one of the things I love about her series is that they do have very high stakes. They do have some very difficult things that go on, and her characters really do go through some terrible events, but ultimately her books are very hopeful, and they also have this very cozy quality to the writing and setting and to the relationships and characters that I think really balances the harshness of the events very beautifully. A series that I have read and loved more recently is the GAEL Song series by Shauna Lawless. This is set in 10th century Ireland. We are following two women who are on opposite sides of a centuries-long years-long war between two magical races. The two of these characters are polar opposites from one another. One of them is ruthless and manipulative in her quest for power and security for herself, her son, and their family. And the other is a very compassionate and naive healer who has to go on an internal journey to discover who she wants to be and what she believes is right in this world. And the two of them create great counterpoints throughout this series with such vastly different perspectives and motives. In addition to our two main characters, there's a whole cast of fantastic characters to follow as they go through a very difficult point in history with conflicts between the people of Ireland and the Vikings who are coming into Ireland. There is culture clash, there are high stakes, there is magic, there is romance. I did find that the first book was a little hard for me to get into because it is really focused on the events and is setting up the series, but the rest of the series then dives more into the characters, and I had a fantastic time with this series. It also has companion novellas, which are some of the best companion novellas I have read. They really add a lot of richness and depth to the characters and the story and the motivations, so they're really worth reading. And the series is continuing on. So the original arc of the GAEL Song trilogy is complete, but there is a Era 2 starting later this year. Next is Spear by Nicola Griffith. This is actually an Arthurian retelling that is a queer gender-bent retelling of the story of Percival, where we're following a young girl who has been secluded in the forest with her mother when she decides to strike out on her own to make a name for herself and potentially become one of the Knights of the Round Table. Along the way, she gets into fights, she speaks to the wind, she has a sapphic romance. The writing in this is just beautiful and lyrical and explores some potential mythological origins for things like the Grail and Excalibur. Another Arthurian retelling, which I actually have a whole Arthurian retelling recommendation video, which I will also link in the description, but another Arthurian retelling for this is Sister Song by Lucy Holland. This is a retelling of the traditional Celtic murder ballad. The Two Sisters or the Twa Sisters or the Cruel Sister. Traditional songs tend to have a lot of different names, but it is a retelling of this traditional murder ballad that is set in Celtic Britain, and in it we're following three siblings, one of whom is trans and is fighting to be recognized as their parents' son. At the same time, a mysterious new man appears who may be sparking some trouble and jealousy among the siblings. I really enjoyed that this is a retelling of a story that we don't often see retold, so it is quite unique in that way. Moving into the more historical fiction with maybe a sprinkle of the fantastical, we have The Lost Queen by Signe Pike. This is historical fiction set in 6th century Scotland, and in it we are following Langoreth, who was a historical figure. She was a queen that is very little is known about her. However, we do know that her brother is the historical figure that some historians believe inspired the story of Merlin. So in this, we are following Langoreth, Merlin's sister. This first book follows just Langoreth's perspective from childhood through young adulthood. Her dream is to become a wisdom keeper, which is essentially like a druid, and she wants to be a healer. However, this is during a time of turmoil as Christianity is making inroads into Scotland and is trying to stamp out the traditional druidic practices and religion. And so Langoreth must make some very difficult decisions and sacrifices and enter into a political marriage to protect not only herself and her family, but their people and their very way of life. This series is not complete. It has one more book planned coming out in 2027, I believe, but there are 3 books out so far. As the series goes on, we get perspectives from more characters as the story and the scope expands over time. Signe Pike's writing is so atmospheric. This is a series that you can really just lose yourself in this world. Next is The White Mare by Jules Watson, the first book in the Del Riata series. I'm gonna put this down because my camera hates blue things and will color correct in a bizarre way if I hold it up, but I'll put a picture up here. This is set in 80 AD tribal Scotland. We have two main characters that we are following. One is Rianne, who is a princess and priestess among her people. She has a traumatic past that we get some flashbacks from, and that trauma continues to affect and inform her character throughout this series. It impacts her distrust of men and also has affected her relationship to her goddess. Our other main character is Eamon, who is a exiled Irish prince who was betrayed and forced off out of his country, and he has now landed on the shore of Rianne's tribe, right in their hour of need as they are fighting off the Romans who are trying to take over their land. Eamon agrees to help them fight the Romans, and to solidify this alliance, he marries Rianne, who is not happy about this situation. Their relationship is one of the main arcs within this series. It is extremely slow and very much impacted and informed by Rianne's trauma. So it is a very slow process to go from hate to allies to friends to lovers, but I loved seeing the arc of their relationship throughout this book. And I think one of the real strengths of this is how realistically and imperfectly these characters are depicted. I do feel like I have to put some caveats on this series. I have two main caveats. One is there are technically 3 books in this series. I would say only the first 2 are worth reading. The first 2 books are really a duology that are a complete story, and then the third book takes place maybe like 100 or 200 years later and is following totally different characters, and I think is really unnecessary to read, and I think really doesn't have any of the same qualities that I think make the first 2 books so good. So I would say just read the first 2 as a duology. But I also have a caveat about that duology, specifically the second book. There is a scene in the second book that involves a character of color that I just felt was not well done, and I had some issues with. I was not very comfortable with the way that that character was represented or used in that scene. So I just do put a caveat on the second book. I think the first book is fantastic. The second one I did have a couple of issues with. And then the last series that I want to recommend today is the BOUDICA or BOUDICA series by Amanda Scott. I'm never quite sure how to pronounce it because I've heard people say this name both ways. I usually say BOUDICA, but this is, again, historical fiction following a warrior queen among Iron Age Celts who led her people in rebellion against the Roman invasion. In this, the BOUDICA or the BOUDICA is not a single person but is a title, and so our main character is Breca, and we follow her from childhood. In this first book, we get the first half of the book is really following her and her tribe. We get to know these characters, their culture, and their spiritual religious practices, which I found fascinating and was really my favorite part so far of this series. I will also say I have not completed this series. I've read 2 of the 4 books, but I have really enjoyed what I have read so far. Amanda Scott has really strong writing and is writing this story on an epic, sweeping scale. And so we're following characters both on the side of BOUDICA or BOUDICA and also on the side of the Romans. Amanda Scott also really does not pull punches on her characters. There are some very difficult and terrible things that happen to her characters, so also look up content warnings for this as well. That would probably go for most of these books, honestly. Maybe look up content warnings if you need them. But this one in particular, her characters really go through it, but it is telling this truly epic story of this fight for freedom alongside the personal stories of the people involved. So those are some of my top recommendations for Celtic historical fantasy and historical fiction. I would love to know if you have any recommendations. As I said, this is my favorite subgenre niche and I am always looking for more. I would love to be able to do an updated or part 2 to this in the future, so I need more books to include. So please let me know if you have any recommendations in the comments. But thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!